Hi, folks. Thank you for joining us for our second week of our candidate webinars. Today we have with us Mike Padmore from AARP, along with a handful of their volunteers that will be saying a couple words this afternoon. We are going to give folks 1 or 2 more minutes to hop on, and in the meantime, I will just walk through the format. So at about 12:05, Zach will get started with a 20-minute presentation from the School Funding Fairness Project, and then the second 20 minutes will be Mike and his crew from the AARP. Around 12:45, we will start doing Q&A. So as you have questions throughout the 2 presentations, feel free to put your questions in the chat. And at 12:45, when we move into Q&A, I will read them off for Mike and Zach. We will be sending around the recording of this presentation this afternoon after we conclude, along with the slide deck that Zach will be using and the contact information for the 2 of them as well. If folks want to introduce themselves in the chat with your name and the town that you live in and what office you're running for, while we give folks 1 more minute, that would be great. Really happy to have you all here. All right, Zach, I'm going to put you in the spotlight and pass things off to you.
Wonderful. Am I coming through clearly?
Yep.
Sound good? All right. Hey, everyone. Thanks for coming to our candidate webinar series here. Really happy to have AARP here and some of the folks they work with to kind of tell some of their perspectives on the issues that they advocate for, both locally and, AARP is a national organization as well, so doing work all over the country. For those of you who have not come to one of these yet, my name is Zach Sheehan. I'm the Executive Director of the New Hampshire School Funding Fairness Project. We've been putting these on for about a 6-week series with 8 different organizations. I'll be diving into SWEPT and property taxes a lot more today than I have in the previous presentations. We're trying to kind of dive into different elements of our issue throughout this series so that the things you're hearing from the School Funding Fairness Project are not the same each time, and that they try to kind of complement or line up with some of the things that our partner organizations will be presenting on as well. So let me go ahead and get started here with sharing my screen. All right, can I get a thumbs up from Casey or Mike that you can see my screen here? Awesome. All right, so this is the 4th one in our series. We have the kind of dates up here for the next handful. Because it's coming up next week, I'll just flag that next Thursday's webinar with Housing Action is the only one of these that is at 10 a.m. It's at a different time, so just wanted to flag that for folks. But we really appreciate you all being here. Real quick, for those of you who are not familiar, School Funding Fairness Project, we're a 501c3 nonprofit organization. We're based in Concord, but we do work all over the state. A large majority of the work we do is educational presentations, similar to the one that I'll be running through this afternoon here. We present to school boards, different school districts, community organizations, civic organizations, all over the state. If you're ever interested in having us kind of come present to your community, please reach out. We're always looking to do more of these around the state and just kind of educate and engage with people about how the school funding system in New Hampshire impacts them and some of the ways that we can work together to advocate for some changes. To start off here, this will look a little familiar from the previous presentations, but it's just a really important and kind of grounding place to start with this issue of school funding and property taxes. This is the total revenue for our public school system in the most previously available data, so last year's data. And we raised and spent, about $3.8 billion on our public school system, which is a significant amount of money for a small state. We do invest and care deeply about our public schools in New Hampshire. And it reflects in the amount of money that we do invest in our local public schools all over the state. The challenge here that this is kind of highlighting, as you can see, is that most of that money comes from local property taxes. And this, I'm really going to dig into this in this webinar today, so it's important kind of to level set with the overall picture here. So about 70% of all of the revenue for public schools comes from local property taxes. Just under 20% comes from the state. It's the lowest share of public school funding provided by the state in the entire country by quite a long shot. And the reliance on property taxes is the highest reliance by quite a long shot. And what that equates to, that 70%, is about $2.7 billion annually. That is, according to Supreme Court rulings over the past few decades, is the responsibility of the state. So it's downshifted annually around the state to local property taxpayers. And the kicker here is that it is downshifted in very inequitable ways. So different people in different communities pay very different rates for their schools with kind of wildly different outcomes, average teacher salaries, et cetera. And that's really what we're going to dig into here this morning. So to kind of set what I mean by inequitable, right? Well, we do have really good public schools. We have a lot of good on average metrics of the amount of money we spend in our schools, overall teacher pay, graduation rates, score rates. A lot of those are good and compare relatively favorably to schools across the country on average. But averages hide a lot of these disparities. So let's walk through a quick comparison here. And we're going to take this comparison and kind of expand it to really take a deeper dive into SWEPT and property taxes specifically. But let's start with kind of some of the more generic metrics that we use to look at school outcomes. So two public schools here, you can see pretty different rates of proficiency in math and reading. Almost 20% different in how many students actually graduate from these high schools. For those students that do take an AP test, generally colleges are looking for a 3 or above to get credit. About 80% in that first school are getting a 3 or above, and only 40%, just about half in the second school there. The average teacher salaries are also significantly different, 85,000 versus compared to about 51,000. Median household income, mirrors almost that difference in the average teacher salary here. Also, the education property taxes, that's including SWEPT, so it's both your local ed and your state property taxes are also pretty different. You can see in that first community there, about $550 per $1,000 of value, and they're about 2.5 times as high in that other community there. And the result of that on a home, say, priced $350,000, which is becoming harder and harder to find in today's housing market. But for an example, you can see that same price home in community A versus community B, dramatically different property tax bills because of the different property tax rates. Now, this is a comparison of Portsmouth over on the seacoast and Claremont up in the Upper Valley here. And what we're really going to zero in on in a moment, I want to give a little more context first, is what is it about these education property taxes and that bill that are so different in these communities? How can they be that different and have significantly different outcomes in their public schools, average teacher salaries? Why is it that Portsmouth has such a low tax rate but is able to afford significantly higher average teacher salaries, has higher student graduation rates? And one thing I'll just say about that is that this is not a lack of a different goal. Claremont does not have a different goal for their public education system. The Claremont City Council is not trying to raise taxes in conjunction with the school board, right? Most communities in most states in this country, most communities in this state are really trying to provide the best they can for their public schools, for their students, balancing the tension and the pressure on local property taxpayers. This is not a different vision from these communities. This is a much more systematic problem at a policy level. So first, to dive in a little bit to SWEPT. What is it? Kind of where did it come from? What's a little of the history? So the statewide education property tax, SWEPT, was first implemented following some of the, the Claremont Supreme Court rulings, when the Supreme Court said the state needs to define and pay for an adequate education. And this was turned to as the solution at the time. Let's create a new statewide education property tax at a higher rate to send money, like the rest of our state taxes, to the state to pay for the state's obligation to fund an adequate education. So we have this new tax, this new rate, a $6 tax back then. It was, much lower property values on average. The interesting thing, though, is that when we added this $6 tax in combination with a new adequacy formula, an education funding adequacy formula, that sent more money, right, to the districts that needed the assistance, right, so actually took into account relative need, the average property tax bill around the state dropped. We added this new property tax. Including that new property tax, the average bill around the state dropped because it was paired with a more equitable funding formula. Now, since then, a good amount has changed, primarily that a coalition of property wealthy towns came together and branded themselves as the donor towns. I'm sure many of you have heard that terminology. It's very clever marketing and branding. They branded themselves as the donor towns, saying that we're donating some of our money to the state that's going to other communities. And they successfully lobbied the legislature to get legislation passed to change SWEPT. So now SWEPT is raised and retained locally. It never goes to the state like the rest of our state taxes. Also, kind of to compare with that, over the past 10 years, the burden, the amount of funding that local property taxpayers are putting up for our public education system has increased by over $600 million. The state's share has increased $47 million. So we kind of continue to increase this pressure on local property taxpayers. At the same time, beginning in that time period, when the state tax that was helping pay for some of that was effectively gutted. So I'm showing this piece, and then that's going to kind of help us understand the more nuanced elements of SWEPT. So this is how we currently calculate what's called the cost of an adequate education. And this is the state's formula, understanding how much money to send to each school district. So they start by assigning $4,100 in base adequacy. So every student in the district gets $4,100 per student. Then there's a number of metrics, these next three numbers, called differentiated aid. And what that is some measures of need. So the first one, students eligible for free and reduced price lunch, additional $2,300 per student. That's not to pay for meals, it's a marker of poverty. Since to be eligible for that program, you have to have at or below, I believe it's 185% of the federal poverty line. And in general, students living in poverty in general need additional resources. The next one is for students receiving special education services. These are students who qualify for an IEP and have a disability that makes it, they need additional services, whether it's half an hour a week for some speech programs or up to full-time placement in a different residential facility. So the state says, we understand you need additional funding for that. We'll kick in a little bit more. Side note, that is nowhere near how much it costs to actually provide those services. We dug into that last week with our webinar with the Disability Rights Center. The last one here is for students who are English language learners. Again, those are just additional services that cost a little more money, and the state acknowledges that and kicks in a little bit per student. The average here is just under $6,000 per student sent around the state. That's this calculated cost of an adequate education. Now, the kicker is that calculated cost of adequate education is laughably small compared to what it actually takes to run and operate the schools that we have here in New Hampshire, which again, on average, are very high-performing public schools. But what you can see here is there's a handful of different communities around the state. No one spends, the closest communities get is about 3 times as much as they get in adequacy aid from the state is what it costs to actually run their public school. And this disparity, the green, which is the actual cost, and then the yellow and blue, which is the state's share that they kick in, that disparity is, you find that in every community all over the state. Urban, rural, more liberal, more conservative, kind of a purple split, you know, all of the above, you find this disparity no matter where you look. Okay, so let's jump in a little bit more to the SWEPT piece of this and kind of how that actually plays out. So first off, we have what I had on the previous slide, the education property taxes in these communities, Portsmouth and Claremont. Now let's break it down a little bit. On your property tax bill, you'd see what, you know, on mine at least says state ed, and that is the SWEP, that's the state education part of the property tax bill. It's not exactly the same all over the state. There's a number of reasons for that, that the DRA you know, has kind of an equalization method they use, but in general, they're pretty close, hovering around 85 to 90 cents per thousand. And here's where the big difference is between these two communities, the local education rate. And the reason that these are so different largely is because Claremont has significantly lower property value on average than Portsmouth. So they have to have a much higher tax rate to squeeze as much as they can out of their residents there. And this really shows that. So what this is showing is in Portsmouth, when they're SWEPT rated at 95 cents per thousand, they raise $11 million from that. Claremont, with a SWEPT rate lower, 20 cents lower, but they only raise $1.3 million. So vastly different sums of money are raised from pretty similar tax rates. Now we compare this to how much the state, remember in their formula with the base adequacy that I was just going through, plus special education, plus free reduced lunch, the state sums that up and says, hey, Portsmouth, we're going to give you $10.2 million. Claremont, we're going to give you $9 million, because that's our formula based on the students in your school district. Now, Portsmouth has already raised $11 million from a state tax, right, that's supposed to be paid for the state's obligation to fund an adequate education. So this is where we get into the donor town, you know, so-called donor town, right? They now have rebranded themselves in the past few years. They're calling themselves the coalition communities, the coalition of the same property wealthy communities. They're spending hundreds of thousands of dollars lobbying and kind of putting out materials trying to keep the system the way it is. But right now, so what you can see is that Portsmouth raises more in SWEPT than they would get from the state. And so that's called excess SWEPT, that $1.1 million. They get to keep that. They can put it towards education. In theory, they're supposed to put it towards education, but it offsets and allows them to keep that local education rate lower because they're keeping that extra state funding that should be going to the state, just like every other state tax, you know, like business profits tax, meals and rooms tax. Claremont, on the other hand, you'll see is nowhere near, right? They only raised $1.3 million from that state rate. They should be getting $9 million. So the state's already kicking in more to send to Claremont because they don't have the property wealth to raise enough from that SWEPT rate. And this really is kind of at the heart of a lot of how we go about changing some of these dynamics here. And one of the main arguments, which will be interesting, kind of, you know, it dovetails nicely with some of the work that AARP is looking at. One of the main arguments that Portsmouth and this coalition of wealthy communities argue is that, okay, just because Portsmouth has, on average, higher property values does not mean everyone in Portsmouth is rich. That is true, but there are a lot of ways to make sure that changes in tax policy take into account someone's ability to pay and make sure that if we do change the system so that SWEPT actually goes to the state, there are ways to make sure that those who can afford to pay actually do. A couple of quick examples of that. We have this program in New Hampshire called the Low and Moderate Income Property Tax Relief Program. This program currently exists. It's currently in law. It currently is administered, but it is frankly a joke for how much relief it provides. For example, in 2021, about 5.5 thousand claims of people saying, I need help with my property taxes. I qualify for these reasons. There's an income limit. There's a housing, how much your house is worth limit. In 2022, the total amount of relief was only $1.4 million. And you can see that for those of you who pay property taxes, while $236 sure would be helpful, that's not really going to be meaningful relief for many people. And the number of claims and the amount of money given has just dropped over time because we've not adjusted the limits. The limits are still so incredibly low that if you make just a tiny bit more money, $60,000, $70,000, you don't qualify. If your home is worth a little bit more, you don't qualify. Everyone's home values are going up. Reassessments are jacking everyone's values up. And so we have this program, but it does not do the job it's supposed to do. This is something we could adjust to help for folks in communities that happen to have more property value now that might have been living there for 20, 30, 40 years, making sure that we take into account, can they weather an increase in property taxes if we change our system? Reforming this would be one way to do that. Another way would be with what's called a homestead exemption. So homestead exemption is you set an amount and say that we're not going to tax the first X dollar value of your home. And what this does is it takes, you kind of lop off, say $200,000. So if my house is worth $500,000, I'm not only paying property taxes on 3 of that. And what that does is it has a bigger impact for folks with home prices that are lower. And then if my home's worth $2 million, sure, I'll get a little tax break from that $200,000 exemption, but not nearly as much as someone who has a more reasonably priced home. So for example, last year or 2 years ago, 2022, 2023, the amount of money that SWEPT was taxing was about $300 billion. And that average SWEPT rate was 86 cents per thousand. So on a $350,000 and $450,000 home, here are the bills just from that SWEPT rate, right? So it's a relatively small portion of your tax bill. But if we were to institute a $200,000 homestead exemption, say, you know what, we understand that not everyone in Portsmouth is rich. That is a true fact. If we're going to change SWEPT, make it a true state tax again, we're going to make sure that folks that can't afford increase don't get it. So we could reduce the amount that's taxed, but we wanted to raise the same amount from SWEPT, which is $363 million. It would increase the rate because we're reducing the kind of pool of money that's available to tax. And this is just a kind of rough, high-level example, but what you see here is that someone with a $350,000 home would pay less, even though their rate's gone up because they get that exemption on over half of the value of their home. Someone with a $450,000 home would pay a little bit more and then kind of be going up from there. I bring this up as an example because these are the types of policies that would be more productive to work on and to think through in the legislature as we're talking about how are we going to change the way in which we fund schools, and is doing a statewide property tax a good way to do that? And there are a lot of ways to make sure that people who cannot afford an increase in taxes, if we were to change the system, are taken care of, and there are exemptions or rebates or things like the low and moderate property tax program that make sure and take that into account and actually provide meaningful relief. And so, with coalitions like the coalition communities that just kind of put up their hands and block any conversations about this, it's frankly unhelpful, and there's a lot of ways to move forward. I think I'm going to skip through a few slides here. So a few other possible kind of revenue solutions, and I'll wrap up and kick it over to Mike and his team. But as we're talking about looking at ways in which we can reimagine how we're funding and paying for education in this state. We just went through a few of the examples for SWEPT. There's also the interest and dividends tax was just repealed. It will be fully phased out by February this year. It's about $135 million that the state's no longer going to be getting in revenue. Most of that revenue was coming from people with extreme amounts of wealth invested, generating income off that interest. And again, not everyone. Some people were earning just $1,000 a year on interest. There are ways to reform taxes like that to make sure that the tax breaks or the policies are actually benefiting people who need it. And lastly, we have a lot of revenue for our business taxes. There's been a lot of in-depth analysis showing that just kind of cutting those blindly across the board and giving handout kind of tax cuts to corporations like Walmart do not always benefit our state. And there are smarter ways to do that to actually take into account how to change tax policies that's benefiting, say, more local businesses on the main street in your community as opposed to these large international corporations. All right, so I'm running a few minutes over time, so I think I'll end there and pass it on over to Mike.
One second, Mike. Let's see. Sorry about that. Let me just pull up the participants part here.
Perfect. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Wonderful. Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mike Padmore, and I'm the Associate State Director of Advocacy for AARP New Hampshire. I really appreciate you all taking the time to join us for this hour. And I also really want to thank Zach and Casey for organizing this series and inviting us to join. I think this is an incredible opportunity. And so what we're going to focus on is two of AARP New Hampshire's priority issues. One is supporting family caregivers, and the other is how we work to protect consumers against fraud. AARP New Hampshire is a volunteer-driven organization. We have 212,000 members across New Hampshire. And so with me on this call, I've invited 4 of our volunteers who are going to be able to give you their perspective on these issues and how they've been involved with this work with AARP and even outside of AARP a bit. But I'm going to kick us off by giving you all some background on these 2 issues, and then I'm going to kick it over to our volunteers to talk a little bit. So first off, I know that many of you indicated that you yourselves are family caregivers. And for those of you who aren't personally caregivers, I'm sure you know someone close to you who is a caregiver. And what I think that illustrates is just how important this issue is and why we really prioritize it, because it is so broad, it impacts so many people across the state. And the other thing is that almost everyone is going to encounter a caregiver situation at some point in their life. And so just to kind of level set, I want to share a few kind of staggering numbers that help to kind of give some context to this issue. So there are 168,000 family caregivers in New Hampshire. And for those caregivers, they are providing 157 million hours of care per year. And that amounts to about $2.8 billion of unpaid labor per year. And then on average, those caregivers are spending roughly $7,200 out of pocket every year to care for their loved one. And so again, these are just numbers, but they help us understand how broad this issue impacts folks in New Hampshire, but also across the country. And so from talking with our members, we know that folks prefer to age in their homes if possible, but that usually requires some aspect of caregiving from either a friend or a family member, or maybe it's even a direct care worker coming into the home. And so caregivers are already busy enough when it comes to caring for their loved one. And so what our job is at AARP is to really understand how we can support these folks. And that's by either advocating in support of policies that help caregivers, or by providing them information on what are the resources that are already available to them. But at the end of the day, it's all about trying to make caregivers' jobs easier. And then the last note I want to make on caregiving is that caregivers, they're they're regular people, right? They're working full-time jobs, they're working part-time jobs. Some of them are able to stay in those jobs, but others may have to leave the workforce to tend for those caregiving needs. And so really this is this is a workforce issue as much as anything else. And I think Pat, who I'm going to go to next, is going to talk a little bit about this, but the more that we can help caregivers, we're also helping our businesses in retaining and finding those employees. And so that's another big aspect of this, and something that we're really trying to do is sort of work within the business community. Moving over to fraud. So fraud prevention is another key issue for us because we know that individuals ages 50 and older are targeted at a higher rate than the general population. AARP tries to work on this issue in a few different ways. One way is through public policy, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. But the other way that we try to help is by actively working in the community to ensure that folks have opportunities to learn about fraud, the common things to look out for, and then what to do if you think you've been scammed. So much of combating fraud really comes down to prevention, and you'll hear a little bit more about that from a few of our volunteers. From the policy side, I want to give a really good example that we actually, it was a win from this past legislative session. Senate Bill 515, it aimed at providing additional oversight and safeguards around extended warranty contracts. And so these are, things that we've probably all gotten in the mail, right? They're for, a car or an appliance maybe that we've purchased. And so what Senate Bill 515 did is it provides additional oversight to vendors who sell these types of contracts and gives the State Department more authority to take action against the companies that are selling these phony warranties. And so I use this as an example because I think it's a really good example of the legislative efforts that we support. And I'm happy to say again that this bill was passed and was signed into law. So with that, what I'd like to do is move over to you hearing from some of our volunteers. And I'd just like to start with Pat McDermott, who is our volunteer state president at AARP New Hampshire. And so Pat, I'm going to kick it over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Mike. Yes, my name is Pat McDermott. I am the volunteer state president for AARP New Hampshire. I'm a New Hampshire native and I live in Hooksett. I'm going to emphasize a couple of things that Mike's already said, but AARP is nonpartisan. We do not advocate for candidates. We're nonprofit. We have, again, this number is correct, 212,000 members in the state of New Hampshire. So it's a big group. We have about 150 or more volunteers who are very active. And we advocate for issues. Again, not candidates, but we advocate for issues affecting those folks that are 50 years old or older, so the 50 plus. The kind of issues that we've been involved with in the last few years: prescription drug costs. We had some great success there in New Hampshire, getting legislation passed there. One that we worked on this year, haven't quite got it over the goal line yet, but is accessory dwelling units. I think everybody understands that New Hampshire is very short on housing, and affordable housing impacts everybody, not just the 50 plus. But we were promoting that. It got through the House, but it was defeated in the Senate. We'll probably give another run at that this year. Another issue that we're working on that's not a legislative issue, but is the Eversource rate case. They propose a significant increase in distribution rates that went into effect temporarily, at least in August, and then again next year. So we're looking hard at that, making sure that it's fair and equitable. Right now, the residential customers are getting a much, much larger share of this increase than the other customers. We work on voter access to make sure people who have the right to vote legally do so and are able to do it. And as Mike said, we talk about fraud and caregiving. We're very active in the legislative process. We do a lot of voter education, making sure people understand these issues and what the implications are. We will have our members and volunteers reach out to our state representatives and our state senators to give them information and also our position on these issues. We attend hearings and we wear red. That's why I wore my red shirt today. We attend hearings and you will see we attend them in force. We have lots of people that attend these hearings, again, to support our positions. We testify at these hearings, and typically we try to have volunteers testify. I think it's a more powerful for someone who believes so much in the issue that they're willing to testify as a volunteer. We write letters to the editor. You may have seen some of those in the papers and in the media. And we also do op-eds occasionally on specific issues. Finally, the 50 plus vote. We vote. So that's really important. I want to spend one more minute speaking about caregiving. As Mike said, there are 168,000 unpaid caregivers in the state of New Hampshire. Again, another huge number. They take care of adults. This is not, we're not talking about daycare or childcare. We're talking about people who take care of adults. They could be their parents, spouses, siblings, adult children, whatever. And as Mike said, 1 in 6 workers are also caregivers. That's a big deal. So one of the areas that we're involved in is working with employers to make their places of business more caregiver friendly. A lot of it is simply education, understanding that simple things that they can do, low or no cost things that can be done to help keep employees in the workforce. Very, very important issue. And I speak from experience here, as I retired early, leaving the workforce at 63 to help my wife take care of our adult son who has autism. Thank you. Back to Mike.
Oh my gosh, sorry. 1 second.
Perfect. And I want to just follow up on something that Pat mentioned around, working with employers. And I think that's one of our big priorities is kind of engaging the business community and kind of understanding, what are the things that we can kind of be working with them proactively on? And then what are sort of those public policy things that kind of help fill in the gaps that would really help business owners when it comes to that caregiving issue. And so with that, thank you so much, Pat. And now I'd like to introduce our next volunteer, Roger DeRozier, who is one of the leaders of AARP New Hampshire's Capital City Task Force. This is our group of about 40 volunteers across the state who help us with our advocacy work. And so thanks, Roger, for joining us, and I'll kick it over to you.
Good afternoon. I have volunteered with AARP for many years. I and my wife were caregivers to my dad for about 18 years, beginning in 2001. During most of those years, we were working full-time as well as being caregivers. My dad was quite independent at 80 years old, but needed much more help after suffering a heart attack. There were many more appointments for medical care and many more prescriptions and other appointments for his eyesight and mobility. This meant more time away from work and less opportunity to meet our own needs. As a result, I retired earlier than planned to be more available to meet my dad's needs. That is when I volunteered with AARP because I could see they were an excellent source of caregiver information and were able to advocate for caregiver needs. AARP New Hampshire worked in those early years to identify the number and needs of caregivers in New Hampshire and potential strategies and services to meet these needs. Caregivers were identified as grandparents caring for their grandchildren when parents had substance abuse problems or who abused or neglected their children. Caregivers were also identified as adult children working full-time, often while caring for their parents. AARP New Hampshire advocated for identifying existing services and providing timely information by helping to establish ServiceLink as an agency designed to be a one-stop service for caregivers who need immediate help in meeting their family needs. For example, a caregiver of an elderly parent needs to know who can provide in-home care for a person who has fallen and needs assistance during the day to use the bathroom or prepare meals while the caregivers are working full-time. AARP New Hampshire has and continues to work on meeting the needs of caregivers by conducting surveys of its members and meeting with advocacy agencies. Some service needs identified are making respite services available so caregivers can take a break from 24-hour care, providing navigation services so a caregiver can coordinate the delivery of medical and in-home services, so a caregiver can coordinate the delivery, so the need for support groups that can assist the caregiver to continue to provide services. The need for transportation services when the caregiver is not available or special transportation is required. While these are some of the needs caregivers have, there are others that are unique to each family's circumstances. The best approach to meeting these needs is to develop a comprehensive system of care that not only meets the most common family circumstances, but also has the flexibility to meet the unique needs of most families in New Hampshire. AARP New Hampshire works with the New Hampshire Department of Human Services and the New Hampshire Commission on Aging, along with other agencies, and advocates to further develop and implement a system of care for healthy agency for all New Hampshire seniors. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Roger. Now, I'd like to move over to fraud and introduce Chief John Brofonsky, who was one of our executive council members and is going to talk about his fraud prevention work with AARP from a law enforcement perspective. Take it away, Chief Brofonsky.
Yes, good afternoon, Mike, and good afternoon to everyone. And thank you all for giving us the opportunity to talk about some of the most important topics that face seniors in New Hampshire and all across the nation. From a fraud perspective, let's perhaps bring this more into focus. The most recent data from AARP reflects that there has been more than $28 billion, that's B with a B, billion with a B, dollars worth of fraud perpetrated against seniors in the United States in the most recent data collection. Of that $28 billion, $8 billion was taken away from seniors 60 and older by people that they don't know. That means roughly the average amount of loss to a senior was around $39,000 for each victim, some quite a bit more and obviously some less. That represents an about 11% increase in the number of senior fraud victims here in the United States. There's about 253,000 in the last census of seniors 65 and older here in the state of New Hampshire. So senior fraud is a significant problem. What's AARP doing about it? Well, first and foremost is education. AARP runs a number of different programs to educate seniors. As Mike said earlier on, prevention with respect to fraud is the most effective way of defeating fraud. But prevention is only one element. This past summer, there was a very well-attended fraud seminar put on by AARP in Concord. AARP brought in an expert attorney, prosecutor from the West Coast, who talked about senior fraud, the types of senior fraud that's perpetrated, and most importantly, what we can do to prevent senior fraud. Probably everyone on this particular call knows someone or perhaps has been a victim or perhaps someone wanted to victimize them from a fraud perspective. As chief of police in Bedford for more than 12 years and 45 years in law enforcement, here in Bedford over the last 12 years, I dare say that there was not a week that went by that there was some case involving victimization of a person more than 60 years old in the town of Bedford. Some of those schemes resulted in significant loss. One case involved a romance fraud in which an elderly person was scammed out of more than $250,000, their entire life savings, as a result of being fraudulently approached by someone overseas. The most frequent type of frauds that we see here in New Hampshire perpetrated against seniors involve grandparent frauds in which people target specific older folks. And then now, with the help of artificial intelligence, are able to convince our seniors that one of their grandchildren or a family member requires financial assistance due to an accident or due to some sort of criminal prosecution, and oftentimes results in significant loss of funds. So gift card fraud is another most frequently used scam that is effective with respect to older folks. And so our fraudulent educational activities here by AARP, both New Hampshire and nationally, are so significant. What can we do? What can you do as legislators in terms of addressing this particular problem? And I can tell you that one of the most frustrating things as chief, and one of the most frustrating things for our detectives and investigators, not only in Bedford, but throughout the state, involve cases and crimes in which it is virtually impossible to track the perpetrators of the fraud. The money, once, for example, someone turns over the PIN number to a gift card, that money is essentially lost and unrecoverable. When perpetrators are overseas, such as the one involved in the romance fraud scam that I talked about, it's very, very difficult to identify those folks and to bring a prosecution. And even when there are prosecutions involving people here in New Hampshire, being able to sustain a conviction in some of these cases or bring enough evidence forward to charge someone is very, very difficult. So I would hope that in the future that some legislators here in the state of New Hampshire think about putting together a committee or a task force that takes a look at fraud from a holistic perspective, not only addressing seniors, but fraud from a holistic point of view, to perhaps find ways that we can improve our law to be able to bring more prosecutions against those who are defrauding our seniors of tens of thousands and, in fact, hundreds of thousands of dollars each and every year. So thank you again all for paying attention, thinking about fraud. And of course, I'm sure you all read just recently that probably everyone on this call may have been the victim of losing their Social Security data due to the most recent breach. And so I would hope that the next level of education involves educating seniors as well as everyone about what they can do to prevent the loss of funds by securing their credit data and other data with the three credit data reporting companies. Thanks again, and I hope you all have a great day.
Thanks, Chief Brofonsky. And I think that's a great segue for our last speaker, Mark Boyd, who leads AARP New Hampshire's fraud fighters. And these are the volunteers that are on the ground in communities across the state, trying to make sure that folks have all the information they need when it comes to understanding how they can identify scams. So over to you, Mark.
Hey, thank you. On behalf of AARP, I'd like to thank you for your service to this state and our 212,000 members. We need your help, and you do it well. Well, I'm the grand finale, so this is going to be quick. So buckle up, and remember, there will be a quiz at the end. Fraud, scams, you can't escape it. It does not discriminate, and it's getting worse every month. Our members, due to our demographics, are being targeted along with others. My goal today to quickly give you a taste of what we are doing in the area of fraud and letting you know we are a resource for you and your constituents. If a constituent calls you up about a fraud issue and you think it's something we can help them with, please refer them. Okay, first of all, the national scene. AARP has a fraud watch network. All you do is go to aarp.org. You can call it up. The Fraud Network is a free resource that helps consumers spot and avoid scams. It provides guidance, offers toll-free fraud helpline, and advocates at various levels to protect consumers and enforce the law. AARP members and non-members, I'll say that again, non-members can access the helpline. The network also offers tip sheets, videos, and scam tracking maps. Locally, on the state level, we have a Speakers Bureau. The Speakers Bureau is made up of trained AARP New Hampshire volunteers. We have 3 3-hour-long workshops that we offer all over the state. 1, Fraud Watch Basics, the Scam Landscape. 2, Government Imposter Scams. And 3, Your Identity, Staying Connected and Protected. We also have some specific workshops. The top 10 scams in New Hampshire, and this is done with Sunny Mulligan Shea of the AG's office and myself. Sunny and I also do another one, Elder and Senior Exploitation and Abuse. And we also have a holiday scam program done in this holiday season, and we have Veterans Exploitation and Abuse. Other events we have in September, we have Detecting and Preventing Fraud Against Older People with AARP fraud expert Doug Shadell. Doug has written a number of books on fraud for AARP. In October, we have 5 shred-a-thons throughout the state that are free to anyone. And also in October, in Manchester, Concord, and Greenland, we will be doing presentations on the local fraud landscape in collaboration with local police departments. Our goal at AARP New Hampshire is to do one of these a month per county next year. In November, we will be mailing postcards to 30,000 Granite Staters with the theme, if you can spot a scam, you can stop a scam. And it's chock full of scam information. We also had some ongoing events. AARP New Hampshire has invested significant funds for print, radio, TV, and digital ads throughout New Hampshire about fraud and how AARP can help you. We collect stories from people who have been victims to share on our website and on social media to help make others aware of red flags. And once again, we are working on introducing some legislation regarding fraud for 2025. Now, in the immortal words of Porky Pig, that's all, folks. Or should I say, that's just the tip of the AARP iceberg on dealing with fraud and scams. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. And I'll round this out just by saying that, you know, we're still exploring some policy solutions in the caregiving and in this fraud space, you know, over the next few months. And so if folks are at all interested in learning more about this, please feel free to reach out to me, and we'd love to talk more. And so with that, I'll kick it back over to Zach.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you, everyone here from the AARP who said a couple of words. We're so happy to have you. So we have just a couple minutes for Q&A. I think maybe we'll just do one quick question each, starting with Mike. Mike, if folks are interested in working on caregiving or fraud legislation, how can they get involved with you? And do you all have your eyes on legislation for the upcoming session at this point?
Yeah, we haven't settled on anything specific. We're right now kind of in the stage of working with some of the different stakeholders that are in this caregiving space, in the fraud space, just to get a sense of what we all kind of want to work on. And so what I'll just say is I'll put my my email in the chat. Feel free to send me a note if folks have questions about any of the stuff we talked about today or about anything moving forward.
Great, thank you. And just a reminder that I'll be sending around Zach and Mike's contact info in the email that'll go out after this as well. And Zach, why does it matter if local communities keep excess SWEP to use on their local education needs?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And I think definitely an argument that some of the communities with higher property wealth make. I think it's just kind of the piece I want people to bring away from getting really in the weeds with SWEP today is that SWEP is a state tax for a specific purpose that the state's supposed to fulfill, which is they're paying for an adequate education. And if communities are able to keep that SWEP and do it for not that purpose, that violates the intent of SWEP, and has been ruled in court that is unconstitutional just last November. It also restricts the ability. Of looking at changing that system and raising potentially more money from SWEP to help alleviate some of the issues we've been looking at. And so it is, one of the few things we think about in the state is kind of being like my town's tax. And it's really important that we kind of break out of that mindset, both from the constitutional pieces of the tax itself, but also from the just realistic element that no town in New Hampshire is just an isolated island. It benefits, I live in Concord, it benefits me in Concord that Bow has a good school system, right? It benefits business owners in Portsmouth that Rochester students are able to access career and technical classes if they want to be able to, hire folks from Rochester. And, we're a really small, tight-knit state, and it is really important that we have school districts all over the state that may or may not be in your literal physical town, that kids can thrive and succeed and have access to those opportunities, and also that taxpayers aren't getting hammered in different ways. And this is a complicated issue. It is very, just like all the other issues that all the presenters have talked about, there's no silver bullet fix. And I think, I kind of want, my last word here is I really want folks to come away from this, at least from our perspective, I imagine from AARP, like, we're here to engage and talk about what some of the solutions can be. We might have some ideas. We might have people that have other ideas. We want to hear from you. And, these are really complicated issues, but we're not going to solve them if we don't acknowledge that they exist, acknowledge the harm that's being done, and work to come to some creative solutions that move in the right direction. So really appreciate you all being here.
Cool. All right. We are about at 1 o'clock. Thank you, Mike and Zach, for everything that you've provided to folks this afternoon and for taking the time to put all of this together. Our next webinar coming up is this coming Tuesday, the 27th, same time from 12 to 1, and we'll be with the Center for Justice and Equity. So if you're not signed up for that and you're interested, you can head to our website and sign up for that. Mike and Zach, if you have any final remarks you would like to say before I close things out, I will turn it over to you to do so.
I would just like to say I really appreciate all the volunteers that spoke today. It's nice to break up. We've been doing a lot of PowerPoints in these presentations. As you can see, I get kind of in the weeds sometimes. So really appreciate you all taking the time. I'm speaking from your personal experiences and the work that you put into volunteering on the issues that you do. So I don't know, Mike, if you have anything else, and I really appreciate you.
No, I think that was very well said, and I appreciate everybody that was able to take the time to join us today. Hopefully, there was some good information here, and again, thanks to Zach and Casey for pulling this all together. We really appreciate the opportunity, and thank you all for your time.